The mystery of a 9,600-year-old lost world does not begin with divers, sonar scans, or broken stone beneath the sea. It begins with words, specifically with the writings of one man living in ancient Greece more than 2,000 years ago. Without him, Atlantis would not exist as a mystery at all. There would be no search for lost underwater cities, no debates about sunken structures, no questions about submerged civilizations. Everything traces back to the philosopher Plato. Around 360 BC, Plato wrote two dialogues that would quietly shape one of the most enduring mysteries in human history. They are called Timaeus and Critias. These texts were not written as history books in the modern sense. They were philosophical conversations, structured as dialogues between characters discussing ideas about society, ethics, and the nature of the ideal state. Yet within these conversations, Plato introduces a story that he insists is not a myth, but a true account of a long-forgotten civilization. Plato was born around 428 BC in Athens. He was a student of Socrates and later the teacher of Aristotle. His influence on Western thought is difficult to overstate, but it is important to understand how he wrote. Plato often used stories to explore ideas. Some were clearly symbolic, others were framed as real events. Atlantis appears in this second category, presented with unusual confidence and detail. In Timaeus, the story is introduced almost casually. The dialogue opens with a discussion about the nature of the ideal society. Socrates listens as Critias, one of the speakers, claims to know a very old story that perfectly illustrates these ideas. According to Critias, this story is not invented. It is ancient, passed down through generations, and preserved by records far older than Greece itself. Plato then expands the story in Critias, which appears to be a continuation. Here the account becomes detailed and specific. Critias explains that the story was originally told to Solon, a respected Athenian lawmaker who lived around 600 BC. Solon, Plato says, traveled to Egypt and visited the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. There, Egyptian priests showed him inscriptions and records carved into temple walls, documenting events from deep antiquity. According to these priests, the Greeks had forgotten much of their ancient past due to repeated natural disasters. Floods, earthquakes, and societal collapse erased memory again and again. Egypt, by contrast, claimed to have preserved its records through long periods of stability. It was from these Egyptian records, Plato says, that the story of Atlantis survived. The priest told Solon that 9,000 years before his own lifetime, a powerful civilization existed beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Most scholars agree this term refers to the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. If taken literally, this places Atlantis around 9,600 BC, a date that immediately stands out. It is far earlier than any known advanced civilization recognized by archaeology. Plato describes Atlantis as a large island, greater in size than Libya and Asia combined, as those regions were understood in the ancient Greek world. From Atlantis, he writes, it was possible to travel to other islands and even to a great continent beyond. Whether this was meant geographically or symbolically remains debated, but the description is clear enough to fuel centuries of speculation. The civilization itself is portrayed as highly organized and wealthy. Atlantis was ruled by kings descended from the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. The island was divided into regions with a central capital built in a striking design of concentric rings of land and water. Canals connected these rings, allowing ships to move through the city with ease. Bridges spanned the water, and harbors supported a powerful navy. Plato describes fertile land, abundant crops, forests for timber, and rich mineral resources. He even mentions a metal called orichalcum, said to be second only to gold in value. While orichalcum has been debated by scholars, it appears in other ancient sources as either a real copper alloy or a symbolic material representing wealth. Politically, Atlantis was presented as orderly at first. The kings ruled according to laws passed down from Poseidon himself. They met regularly to judge disputes and govern collectively. For a time, the civilization lived in balance, respecting both divine order and human limits. But that balance did not last. Plato emphasizes moral decline as the turning point. Over generations, the divine element within the Atlanteans weakened. Greed replaced restraint. The desire for power grew stronger than respect for law. Eventually, Atlantis sought to expand its influence beyond its island, launching an aggressive campaign against other lands. In this conflict, Plato introduces ancient Athens as a counterexample. He describes it as a virtuous and disciplined society that stood alone against the Atlantean Empire. Despite being outnumbered, Athens defeated Atlantis and freed other regions from its control. This portrayal aligns closely with Plato's philosophical views on ideal governance and moral strength. Then comes the most famous part of the story. After the war, Plato writes, catastrophic natural disasters struck. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the sea and disappeared. The ocean where it once stood became shallow and muddy, impassable to ships. This image has echoed through history, shaping ideas about deep-sea mystery and lost underwater cities. What makes this account so compelling is not just its drama, but its precision. Plato provides names, timelines, locations, and political systems. This level of detail is unusual for pure myth, yet the story exists in isolation. No Greek writer before Plato mentions Atlantis. No Egyptian inscriptions have been found that confirm it. Later writers who discuss Atlantis are always responding to Plato, never adding independent evidence. This absence is the first and most important layer of the mystery. Atlantis stands on a single source. In historical research, this would normally be a reason for caution. But Plato does not present the story as a rumor. He insists on its authenticity, emphasizing its preservation through respected figures and ancient records. To understand why Plato's audience may have accepted this, it helps to understand Greek culture at the time. Ancient Greeks did not draw hard lines between myth, philosophy, and history. Stories were tools for exploring truth. Homer's epics shaped Greek identity without being treated as literal records. Myths explained human behavior, natural forces, and moral lessons. Plato himself criticized poets for misleading people. Yet he continued to use stories as teaching tools. The difference in his view was purpose. His narratives were meant to guide thought, not entertain blindly. Atlantis appears during a discussion about the ideal state, suggesting it served a philosophical function. But that does not automatically mean it was invented. This creates the central tension that carries through every discussion of Atlantis. Was it a historical account preserved imperfectly through time? Was it an allegory designed to teach moral lessons? Or was it something in between, a story inspired by real events but reshaped to serve philosophy? The chapter ends with that question still open. Plato did not invent Atlantis out of thin air, at least not openly. But he also did not provide proof beyond his own authority. What kind of real events, memories, or disasters could have inspired a story dated to 9,600 BC, a time long before known civilizations? That question is where the mystery truly begins, and it is the thread that guides everything that follows. To understand why the date 9,600 BC matters so much, it helps to step away from Plato for a moment and look at the world as science understands it at that time. Not to argue against the story, and not to force it to fit modern expectations, but to see what Earth and humanity actually looked like at the end of the last ice age. This moment in time sits at a quiet but profound turning point, one that reshaped landscapes, coastlines, and human memory in ways that are still being uncovered. Around 9,600 BC, the planet was emerging from a long period of cold, known as the last glacial maximum. For tens of thousands of years, massive ice sheets covered large parts of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. These glaciers locked up enormous amounts of water. When the climate began to warm, the ice did not vanish all at once. It melted slowly, year after year, century after century. But the impact of that melting was global. As the ice retreated, sea levels began to rise. Over the course of several thousand years, oceans rose by more than 100 meters. That change did not happen overnight, but it was relentless. Shorelines moved inland. Low-lying plains disappeared. Entire coastal regions were gradually flooded. Places that had once been dry land, rich with plants and animals, slipped beneath the sea. This matters because humans have always been drawn to water. Rivers, lakes, and coastlines provide food, transportation, and fertile soil. Even the earliest known communities tended to cluster near these resources. When sea levels rose, many of those early living spaces would have been lost, not destroyed in a dramatic instant, but quietly erased as water advanced and people moved away. Modern maps show only the world as it looks today. But when scientists reconstruct Ice Age coastlines, a different picture emerges. Vast continental shelves once stood above water. Areas like the North Sea, parts of Southeast Asia, and regions along the Mediterranean had wide coastal plains where people could live and travel. These landscapes are now submerged, forming part of the deep sea mystery that underwater archaeology continues to explore. This does not mean advanced civilizations were hiding beneath the waves, but it does mean that parts of human history are missing. Settlements built of wood, earth, and simple stone would leave little trace after thousands of years underwater. Even larger structures could be scattered by currents, buried by sediment, or broken down by erosion. The sea is both a preserver and a destroyer, depending on conditions. In 9600 BC, human societies were still small by modern standards. According to mainstream archaeology, most people lived as hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally in search of food. Agriculture was just beginning to emerge in a few regions. Permanent villages were rare, and large cities, writing systems, and formal states did not yet exist, at least based on current evidence. This is one of the main reasons Plato's date causes skepticism. The Atlantis he describes is organized, wealthy, and technologically impressive. It has planned cities, laws, harbors, and a powerful navy. Nothing like that has been conclusively identified from this period. From a scientific perspective, a globe-spanning empire at 9600 BC does not fit what is known about human development. Yet science also tells a story of revision. Ideas about early humans have changed dramatically over the past century. For a long time, they were portrayed as simple, disorganized, and incapable of complex planning. That view has steadily eroded as new discoveries have emerged. One of the most important sites in this discussion is Göbekli Tepe, located in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in the 1960s but excavated in detail starting in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the site dates to around 9600 BC. That date alone is striking. It places Göbekli Tepe firmly in the same era Plato assigns to Atlantis. Göbekli Tepe is not a city. It has no houses, no streets, no signs of daily domestic life. But what it does have is monumental architecture. Massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, were carved and arranged into circular enclosures. The stones are decorated with detailed carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human-like forms. Creating this site required planning, cooperation, and skilled labor. What surprised archaeologists most was not just the scale, but the timing. Göbekli Tepe appears to have been built by people who had not yet adopted full agriculture. These were hunter-gatherers organizing large construction projects long before cities or states emerged. This discovery forced researchers to rethink long-held assumptions about early human capability. It is important to be clear here. Göbekli Tepe is not Atlantis. There is no connection in location, description, or function, but it serves as a reminder that the archaeological record is incomplete and that early humans were capable of more than once believed. Complexity did not appear suddenly with cities and writing. It developed unevenly in ways that do not always leave clear traces. Other sites reinforce this picture. Early settlements in the Levant, such as Jericho, show evidence of walls and towers dating back thousands of years before previously expected. These were not empires, but they demonstrate organized communities responding to shared needs. Step by step, the image of early humanity has become more nuanced. Against this backdrop, the idea of lost coastal communities becomes easier to consider, even without invoking Atlantis itself. As sea levels rose, groups living near shorelines would have been displaced. Some may have moved inland. Others may have merged with neighboring groups. Over generations, memories of drowned lands could have been preserved in stories, stripped of detail but heavy with meaning. Oral tradition is fragile, but it can be powerful. Stories change as they are retold. Dates stretch, places shift. Real events blend with symbolism. By the time Plato heard of Atlantis, if such memories existed, they would have passed through many hands and cultures. They would no longer resemble a clear historical record. This does not mean the story is secretly accurate. It means it could be inspired by real experiences of loss. Flooding was not abstract in the ancient world. Communities watched water claim land within living memory. In some regions, this process continued well into the early Holocene, the geological epoch that began around 9,700 BC. From a scientific standpoint, there is no evidence of a sudden global flood that destroyed a single massive civilization in one day and night. Sea level rise was gradual. Geological processes do not support the disappearance of a continent-sized island without trace. These facts matter, and they set firm boundaries on interpretation. At the same time, science acknowledges uncertainty. Underwater archaeology is still a young field. Large areas of the continental shelf remain unexplored. Technology improves every decade, revealing sunken structures, ancient shorelines, and submerged landscapes that were invisible before. Each discovery adds context, even when it does not provide answers. This is where the tension lies. On one side, there is clear evidence of gradual environmental change and early human adaptability. On the other, there is a detailed ancient story placing a complex society at the heart of that changing world. The two do not align neatly, but they do overlap in time. The question, then, is not whether Atlantis existed exactly as described. Science does not support that conclusion. The more interesting question is how stories of loss survive periods of dramatic change, how memories of drowned lands, abandoned coastlines, and vanished communities could echo across thousands of years. In that sense, the world of 9,600 BC does not solve the mystery. It reframes it. It shows a planet in transition, reshaping itself through rising seas and shifting climates. It shows humans adapting, organizing, and building in ways once thought impossible for their time. And it leaves open the possibility that fragments of real experiences were later woven into a story that outlived them all. The mystery deepens not because science has failed, but because it reveals just how much has already been lost to the water. As centuries passed after Plato wrote his dialogues, the story of a lost world did not disappear. Instead, it changed shape. What began as a philosophical account slowly became a question of geography and evidence. As maps expanded and oceans were explored, some readers wondered whether Atlantis was not just an idea, but a place that might still leave traces somewhere on Earth. This shift began in earnest during the Age of Exploration. From the 15th century onward, European sailors crossed the Atlantic, charted coastlines, and returned with reports of unfamiliar lands. For some thinkers, these discoveries revived interest in Plato's words. If vast regions of the world had remained unknown for so long, perhaps an island described in ancient Greece could have existed and been lost to time. Over the centuries, many locations were proposed. Islands in the Atlantic, areas in the Mediterranean, even regions far beyond what Plato could have known. But rather than comparing these ideas one by one, it is more useful to step back and ask a simpler, more disciplined question. Has any physical evidence ever been found that matches Plato's description and his timeline? When examined carefully, the answer is clear. No confirmed site dated to around 9,600 BC shows evidence of a large, organized island civilization with cities, harbors, temples, and a complex political system. This conclusion does not come from a lack of interest or effort. It comes from decades of investigation using modern scientific tools. To understand why this matters, it helps to know how archaeology works today. Archaeologists do not rely on surface appearance alone. Claims must be supported by datable materials such as stone tools, pottery, organic remains, or construction methods that fit a known cultural pattern. Sites must show layers of occupation, signs of daily life, and continuity over time. Without these elements, a structure cannot responsibly be identified as a lost city. In the case of underwater archaeology, the standards are the same, and often even stricter. The ocean floor is complex. Sonar scans and satellite images can reveal shapes that look artificial at first glance. Straight lines, right angles, and flat platforms appear striking when seen through remote sensing. But appearance alone is not enough. Many natural processes can create features that resemble human construction. Fractured bedrock can form steps. Erosion can produce straight edges. Volcanic activity can leave behind geometric shapes. For this reason, underwater archaeologists require clear evidence of human activity, such as work stone, tools, anchors, or artifacts embedded within a cultural layer. Despite widespread interest in Atlantis, no underwater survey has produced evidence that meets these criteria for a site dating back to 9600 BC. Advanced sonar mapping, submersible dives, and sediment analysis have been carried out across many regions. These efforts have revealed shipwrecks, ancient harbors, and submerged landscapes, but nothing resembling the civilization Plato described. This absence often frustrates those who expect a dramatic discovery, but it is important to separate what has not been found from what has been found. Underwater archaeology is a real and productive field, and it has confirmed that human settlements can and do sink beneath rising seas. One of the most studied examples is Pavlopetri, located off the coast of southern Greece. Discovered in 1967 and later mapped in detail by teams from the University of Nottingham, Pavlopetri is a submerged Bronze Age settlement. Its streets, buildings, and tombs are clearly visible underwater. The site dates to around 3000 to 1100 BC, far later than Atlantis, but it proves an important point. Entire towns can be preserved beneath the sea. Pavlopetri also shows what real evidence looks like. The layout makes sense for human habitation. Artifacts match the period. Construction techniques align with known cultures. Radiocarbon dating confirms its age. There is no guesswork involved once the data is examined. Other submerged sites tell similar stories. Along ancient coastlines, archaeologists have found drowned villages, fishing structures, and tools left behind as sea levels rose. These discoveries are part of ancient ocean discoveries that reshape how early human history is understood. But again, they are modest in scale. They reflect small communities adapting to environmental change, not vast island empires. Why, then, does Atlantis remain so persistent in public imagination? Part of the reason is that underwater environments feel hidden and mysterious. A deep-sea mystery naturally invites speculation, especially when visibility is limited and exploration is difficult. But science depends on what can be measured, dated, and compared, not on what feels compelling. Another reason is that some underwater features genuinely look unusual. Over the years, photographs and videos have circulated showing submerged steps, walls, or platforms. Without context, these images can be convincing. But when examined closely by geologists and archaeologists, most are explained through natural formation. This careful skepticism is not meant to dismiss curiosity. It exists to protect accuracy. History is filled with cases where early excitement gave way to more grounded explanations. In underwater archaeology, patience is essential. Each claim must survive scrutiny from multiple disciplines. Satellite imaging has added another layer to the search. Modern technology can detect variations in seafloor depth and structure across large areas. These tools are excellent for identifying ancient shorelines and potential sites for further study. They have helped locate sunken structures related to known civilizations. But even with this technology, no candidate for a 9,600-year-old lost world has emerged. What researchers have found instead is a clearer picture of how coastlines shifted. Mapping ancient shorelines shows where humans could have lived before flooding. These reconstructions guide underwater surveys and help identify promising areas. In this sense, the search has refined our understanding of submerged civilizations, even if it has not confirmed Atlantis. It is also worth noting that Plato's description includes details that would leave unmistakable traces if they were real. A powerful navy implies shipbuilding facilities. Large stone temples suggest quarrying and transport. A complex city layout would leave patterned foundations. These features, if present on a large scale, would not vanish completely without leaving material evidence. The absence of such evidence does not automatically mean Plato invented the story with dishonest intent. Ancient writers often blended moral lessons with historical memory. Plato himself used stories to explore ideas about power, virtue, and decline. Whether Atlantis was meant as literal history or philosophical example remains debated. What archaeology can say is more limited, but also more solid. Claims must rest on evidence. At present, there is no verified site that matches both the description and the date given by Plato. This boundary matters, because without it, speculation quickly turns into certainty without support. At the same time, science remains open to discovery. New technology, deeper surveys, and continued research may reveal more submerged settlements from early periods. Each confirmed site adds to the broader picture of human adaptation to rising seas. These are real stories, grounded in data, and they are compelling in their own right. The uncomfortable truth, then, is not that the mystery has been solved, but that it is constrained. The absence of evidence does not prove that Plato was lying or that the story has no connection to reality, but it does limit what can responsibly be claimed today. Between philosophy and physical proof lies a wide space. Atlantis sits there still, not as a confirmed lost city, but as a question shaped by what we have searched for and what we have found. And in that space, curiosity continues, guided not by certainty, but by evidence and restraint. By the time modern scholars began to study Atlantis seriously, the question had shifted. It was no longer only about where the lost world might have been, but about how the story itself should be read. To understand that, researchers first had to return to the source and examine the way Plato wrote, not just what he described. Plato was not a historian in the modern sense. He was a philosopher. His works were written as dialogues, imagined conversations used to explore ideas about ethics, politics, and human behavior. Atlantis appears in two of these dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, and it is important to notice what is happening in those texts. The story is introduced during a discussion about ideal societies and what happens when power is used without restraint. For many classicists, this context matters more than the details of the island itself. They argue that Atlantis functions as a contrast. On one side stands ancient Athens, portrayed as disciplined and virtuous. On the other stands Atlantis, wealthy and advanced, but eventually corrupted by greed. The collapse of Atlantis fits neatly into Plato's broader philosophical concern with moral decline. From this perspective, the story is less a record of a lost civilization and more a lesson wrapped in narrative form. This does not mean scholars dismiss the story as meaningless fiction. Instead, they approach it with caution. Historians are trained to treat single-source accounts carefully, especially when those accounts describe extraordinary events. Without independent records, archaeology, or contemporary references, a story cannot be accepted as factual history in the usual sense. That standard applies to all ancient claims, not just Atlantis. The absence of corroborating evidence places Atlantis in a different category. It becomes a text to be interpreted rather than a site to be excavated. Scholars ask what the story reveals about the culture that produced it and what influences may have shaped it. One influential idea among researchers is often called the composite theory. This view suggests that Plato did not invent Atlantis from nothing, but neither did he describe a real place as it existed. Instead, he may have drawn from multiple sources. Floods, earthquakes, and the collapse of coastal communities were real experiences in the ancient Mediterranean world. Over generations, memories of such events could blend together. Geological evidence confirms that the region experienced powerful earthquakes and tsunamis long before Plato's time. Coastal settlements were destroyed or abandoned. Sea levels rose, swallowing low-lying land. These were not isolated incidents. They were recurring features of human life near unstable shorelines. When viewed this way, Atlantis can be seen as a symbolic gathering of real disasters into a single dramatic story. Oral tradition plays a key role here. Before widespread writing, history was remembered through storytelling. Oral accounts change as they are passed down. Dates stretch. Locations blur. Separate events merge. A local flood might become a great deluge. A fallen town might become a lost civilization. By the time such stories are written down, they often carry layers of meaning added by each generation. Plato himself acknowledged that the story came from earlier sources. He traced it back to Egyptian priests and to Solon, who lived 2 centuries before him. Even if this chain of transmission is accepted, it implies centuries of retelling before Plato ever put the story into writing. During that time, precision would have given way to symbolism. This helps explain one of the most debated aspects of Atlantis, its age. Plato places its destruction 9,000 years before Solon, an extraordinary claim even by ancient standards. Many scholars believe this date was not meant to be taken literally. Assigning a story to the distant past gave it authority. It placed it beyond easy challenge and removed it from the political disputes of Plato's own time. In ancient literature, exaggerated time spans were common. Kings ruled for impossibly long lives in early chronicles. Civilizations were said to stretch back tens of thousands of years. These numbers were not meant to be audited. They were meant to impress and to signal antiquity. Seen in this light, the date of Atlantis may reflect storytelling convention rather than historical calculation. Importantly, most scholars do not accuse Plato of deliberate deception. Within his intellectual world, using stories to explore truth was accepted practice. Myths, parables, and allegories were tools for thinking. Plato used similar techniques elsewhere, including the famous allegory of the cave. No one searches for the cave itself because its purpose is philosophical, not geographical. At the same time, scholars resist drawing a sharp line between myth and reality. Ancient writers did not separate these categories the way modern readers do. A story could be meaningful, instructive, and inspired by real events all at once. Atlantis may belong to this middle ground. This approach also explains why debates about Atlantis persist. Different disciplines ask different questions. Archaeologists look for material remains. Historians evaluate sources. Philosophers examine meaning. Each group applies its own methods and reaches conclusions that do not always overlap. This is not confusion. It is specialization. Scholars also emphasize what Atlantis is not. It is not evidence of a forgotten global empire. It does not support claims of advanced ancient technology beyond what archaeology documents. It does not override what is known about early human societies. Treating it as literal history would require ignoring the standards used for all other ancient claims. At the same time, dismissing it entirely would miss its cultural significance. Atlantis has shaped how people think about loss, progress, and collapse. It has influenced later writers, artists, and thinkers. It has framed discussions about submerged civilizations and ancient ocean discoveries, even when those discussions are grounded in real evidence. In modern academic work, Atlantis often appears as a case study. It demonstrates how stories survive, change, and influence understanding. It shows how a single text can generate centuries of interpretation. It also highlights the importance of distinguishing between evidence and imagination, especially in fields like underwater archaeology, where visual ambiguity can easily lead to overinterpretation. When scholars draw boundaries around Atlantis, they are not closing the conversation, they are clarifying it. They acknowledge what can be said with confidence and what remains speculative. This careful separation allows real discoveries, such as confirmed sunken structures and lost underwater cities, to be studied on their own terms, without being forced into a mythological framework. In the end, scholarly disagreement about Atlantis does not signal failure. It reflects a shared commitment to method. Evidence is weighed, sources are questioned, assumptions are tested. Where certainty ends, interpretation begins, and scholars are careful to label it as such. Atlantis, then, occupies a unique position. It is not accepted history, but neither is it empty fiction. It is a story shaped by philosophy, memory, and imagination, interpreted through the lens of modern research. Understanding how scholars read it does not solve the mystery, but it does define its limits. And within those limits, the story continues to invite reflection, not as a lost map to be followed, but as a narrative that reveals how humans make sense of their past. By the time the discussion reaches the present day, something important becomes clear. Atlantis has not survived because science ignored it or failed to investigate it. It has survived because it was investigated carefully, again and again, and placed where it belongs. Modern research has tested the claim of a 9,600-year-old lost world and found no physical proof that such a civilization existed as Plato described. That conclusion is not a disappointment, it is a result. Science has done what it is meant to do. Archaeologists have searched coastlines and seabeds. Geologists have reconstructed ancient landscapes. Historians have studied texts and compared sources. The absence of evidence does not point to a cover-up or a misdiscovery. It defines a boundary. Atlantis, as a literal empire that sank in a single night does not fit within what the evidence supports. And yet, the story does not fade. It remains because Atlantis represents ideas that are undeniably real. Rising seas are not myths. At the end of the last ice age, coastlines across the world changed dramatically. Vast areas of land were flooded as glaciers melted and oceans expanded. People living along those shores were forced to move, adapt, or disappear. Archaeology confirms this pattern again and again. Human settlements did not always sit where modern maps place them. This is where the emotional power of Atlantis begins. It touches a true loss. Not a golden empire, but countless small communities whose homes now lie beneath the water. Fishing villages, early towns, and seasonal camps vanished as shorelines shifted. Most left no written records. Their stories ended without names. Underwater archaeology continues to bring fragments of that lost world into view. Sites like Pavlopetri in Greece, now carefully mapped and studied, show streets, buildings, and courtyards preserved under shallow water. These are not legends. They are documented sunken structures, dated and analyzed using modern tools. Similar submerged landscapes have been identified in the North Sea, the Black Sea, and parts of the Mediterranean. Each discovery adds detail to human history, but it also adds humility. They remind researchers how incomplete the record is. What survives is often an accident of preservation. What is lost may never return. This reality does not validate Atlantis as history, but it explains why the idea continues to feel plausible to many people. Atlantis also endures because civilizations do collapse. This is not speculation. It is a pattern. Archaeology is filled with examples of societies that decline through a mix of environmental stress, political instability, and human choice. The reasons differ, but the outcome is familiar. Cities empty, knowledge fragments, skills disappear. Later cultures inherit ruins without understanding who built them or why. Plato's story captures that arc in a simple, memorable way. A society rises, prospers, loses balance, and falls. That sequence repeats across history long after Plato's time. Because of that, readers continue to see reflections of their own world in his words. Atlantis becomes less about the past and more about how humans think about progress and permanence. There is also a psychological reason the mystery persists. Humans are drawn to questions that remain open but bounded. Atlantis offers structure. It has a date, a location, a description. It feels concrete. At the same time, it resists closure. There is no final discovery that ends the debate. That balance keeps the story alive without demanding belief. Importantly, Atlantis does not require rejection of science to remain interesting. It exists alongside it. Researchers who study submerged civilizations do not chase Plato's island. They document real sites, analyze sediments, and date artifacts. Yet public interest often returns to Atlantis because it provides a narrative frame. It connects individual discoveries into a larger human question about loss and memory. In this way, Atlantis has shaped how people talk about deep-sea mystery and ancient ocean discoveries, even when the evidence points elsewhere. It has encouraged curiosity about what lies beneath the water, while also teaching caution. Past exaggerations have made modern scholars more careful with claims. Assertions now require proof. Visual similarities are tested against geology. Patterns are examined, not assumed. The legacy of Atlantis has quietly improved the discipline. It has shown how easily stories can outgrow facts. It has reinforced the importance of method. In underwater archaeology, where light is limited and shapes can deceive, this lesson matters. Straight lines do not equal walls. Flat surfaces do not equal floors. Context is everything. Atlantis also persists because it allows room for reflection rather than conclusion. For some, it symbolizes lost knowledge, the idea that earlier societies understood the world differently. For others, it is a warning about power and imbalance. For many, it is simply a compelling story that sits between history and imagination without needing to be resolved. What keeps it relevant is that it does not force a choice. One does not have to believe in a sunken empire to find value in the story, nor does one have to dismiss it as nonsense to respect its influence. Atlantis functions as a question rather than an answer. That question has changed over time. It is no longer, "Where is Atlantis?" It is, "Why does this story continue to matter?" The answer lies in how humans engage with the past. History is not only a record of events, it is also a process of interpretation. Stories survive because they help people think through uncertainty, loss, and change. From this perspective, the true mystery behind the 9,600-year-old lost world is not geographic. It is human. Atlantis endures because it sits at the intersection of evidence and imagination, reminding people that the past is both knowable and incomplete. Science can explain what likely did not happen. It can map coastlines, date settlements, and rule out impossibilities. What it cannot do is erase the emotional weight of stories that speak to real experiences. Plato's account survives not because it hides a secret map, but because it framed those experiences in a way that lasted. By placing moral lessons inside a detailed narrative, he ensured they would be remembered. The ambiguity was not a flaw, it was a feature. Seen this way, the shock is quieter than many expect. The truth is not that Atlantis was hidden from the world or deliberately erased. It is that the story was never meant to be solved like a puzzle. It was meant to be revisited, questioned, and reinterpreted as knowledge grew. Atlantis remains with us because it encourages careful thought. It invites people to ask how evidence is weighed, how stories change, and how much of the human past has slipped beyond recovery. In that sense, the lost world has never been underwater. It has always existed in the space between what we can prove and what we wonder about. And that space, shaped by science, history, and curiosity, is where the story continues to belong.